I'm Linda Squires, and I'm doing the reading today. Selma. 3 weeks before I went to Selma, I flew to Denver to be with my sister while she was having surgery. I came back after 5 days and went back to work. I called my 93-year-old mother to see how she was. She told me that a few days ago she had gotten up in the middle of the night and fell, hitting her back on the desk near her bed. So she wasn't doing too well. When I called her again, her back was doing a little better, but she couldn't get out to go to lunch with the rest of the residents where she lived. I got off the phone and I told Colleen, I'm going to see my mom before we go to Selma. I left on a Thursday afternoon, drove to my mother's, stayed for less than 24 hours, fixed what I could, and then drove back. By the time we left for Selma on Tuesday, driving in a snow and then ice storm, I had a cold. Thursday morning, we met our friends, Emily and Anders, and went to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. It was right across from the Baptist church, which had been bombed and 4 little girls died. I was so grateful we had gone to the Jim Crow Museum at Fair State because it prepared me for what I saw and experienced. That afternoon, we went to Selma and saw where Reverend James Reed had got attacked in Brown Chapel, where he was eulogized by Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King. Later, we went to the Baptist Tabernacle Church in Selma, where they had the first mass voters meeting in Selma in 1965, and got to hear Reverend Bernice King, daughter of Dr. King, and Reverend William Barber, president of the NAACP in North Carolina. Reverend King talked about heaven being the room in which people with long spoons feed each other. And Reverend Barber, I would listen and follow Reverend Barber anywhere. He is that good. We got back to the hotel late, and by the next morning, my cold was gone. It was like I didn't have time for a cold. Wow. At the Unitarian Universalist Living Legacy Conference, we heard a panel of Unitarian Universalist people who were in Selma in 1965. We also had the great privilege of hearing Reverend Barber speak again. He talked about taking back your own state, and that we needed to get beyond labeling Democrats and Republicans, and he talked about what is the moral thing to do. The march in Selma was awesome. To be with other UUs in our yellow shirts and walking with everyone else was great. The songs sung during that time had such a deeper meaning, which I now understand. I came back a happier, better person who is grateful for my life and inspired to do something more here in Michigan. Why? I saw the poverty still there, the struggle, the suffering experienced back then, and now the setbacks we are currently dealing with around voting rights. Yet I saw that in 1965, people came together and made things better. Even when things are bad, people believe there can be heaven here on earth. And now I am one of them. Thank you.
So back in January, we went as a group to see the movie Selma. I think at our final count, we were pretty close to about 40 of us going to see the film together. And for those of you who couldn't make our arranged night, our movie night, you went on your own. So we actually wound up being well over the number of 50 or so seeing Selma. When there's such a high response to something, it shows engagement, sincere interest, a care for the topic. This is called showing up. And in life, it is important to show up. When and where you show up is entirely up to you. But I will tell you this, when and where you show up says a lot about what you truly care about. Earlier this week, one of you poignantly reminded me of the famous quote by George Bell, "You can pretend to care, but you can't pretend to show up." It really struck a nerve with me. And even our Unitarian Universalist Association president, Peter Morales, actually referred to this very same quote in his column in this month's UU World magazine, where he speaks about going to Selma, and he says, "You can pretend to care, but you can't pretend to show up." Selma, and our history with Selma is all about us showing up. Now, I did not get this. I did not get this. And I mean at a core level, at a gut level, until I showed up in Selma 50 years later. Now, we arrived in Birmingham, Alabama on a Wednesday afternoon, and the next day about 250 UUs loaded up on 5 big buses, and we drove 90 miles south to Selma. Now, I had no idea how remote this small little town called Selma was. I didn't know it until we started trying to make these tight little turns on these giant buses. Now, 250 people on 5 gleaming white buses driving through the town of Selma does not go unnoticed. No matter how significant the weekend's going to be, we were noticed. Now I started thinking about myself about Dr. King. And I started thinking repeatedly, he chose this place? This place to change history? This seemingly forgotten corner of the deep, deep South to make a stand? Quite fascinating a decision. Selma could have easily flown under the radar, and probably had flown under the radar for years. But in that moment, everything was right. 50 years ago, it was a scalding crucible about to boil over. But on the day we arrived in Selma, it was absolutely freezing. It was a painful, biting cold, completely unseasonable. And as we drove in the buses and we drove past that bridge, that famous bridge, and then we turned down the corner where Walker's Cafe once served that fateful dinner to 3 Unitarian Universalist ministers, we drove past that, and not 50 feet down the road was the marker that honored the life and death of the Reverend James Reed. Now, we all got out of our warm buses and we started snapping photographs, started taking pictures of the marker, but then the adult children and grandchildren of Reverend Reed stood for photographs for us. And then we all gathered around them, almost like giving them warmth. And they spoke about what this weekend meant to them. And they talked about their father's decision to show up, to answer Dr. King's call, and how that decision changed their lives forever. They said that many of them had been back on other anniversaries, but that this one was the first time their mother was going to be there. First time in 50 years Marie Reed was going to return to Selma. They spoke about how young they were when their father died. They said the youngest of them was 3, and the oldest was just turning 12. They said what they knew about their father was what they read about him in books. That's how they knew who he was. And finally they said, oh, those UUs have always been so kind to us. In fact, some of us have even visited a UU church or 2. We were standing outside and we were freezing and shivering, and we decided to get back on the bus, onto the warm buses. And when we got on the bus, they said we were going to go down the street and turn the corner, and it would bring us to Brown Chapel. And we were told that they were not going to let anybody anybody inside that church, but that we could stand outside and take as many pictures of the inside or on the outside as we wanted. And so because it was so cold, just a few of us went out there, and I was elected from our group. So a group of us were freezing, and we're snapping pictures, and we're standing on the driveway, and the pastor, Gladys Strong, was trying to back out of the church driveway. And I can tell you he was a little frustrated and a little overwhelmed, probably too many visitors during the week. And at one point he got out of his pickup truck a little aggravated. And he turned to one of us and he said, "So who are you here with anyway? What group are you with?" And my friend, she said, "Oh, we're the Unitarian Universalists." And he said, "The Unitarians? Let me get the keys, because I'm going to let you inside my church." And we stood in utter amazement. And I was the one actually standing at the door when Pastor Strong came with the keys. And I said to him, "Thank you, sir. Thank you for letting us into your church. It is so generous of you to let us in." And he said, "You are the Unitarians. You are very special people to us. The Unitarians showed up. It's an honor for me to let you in my church. I am the one thanking you." Selma. And our history with Selma is all about us showing up. And I did not get that until I showed up for myself, and I showed up on behalf of you. We walked into Brown Chapel, and I can tell you, it was like walking onto holy ground. This is the chapel where the marchers gathered on that day that would become known as Bloody Sunday. These were the pews where they sat, where they readied themselves, anticipating only brutality waiting for them on the other side of that bridge, and they knew it. And this is where they were. And it was also the same chapel that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. eulogized the Reverend James Reed just a few days later. It was there in that chapel that King said rhetorically, who killed Jim Reed? And he answered right away, and he said, "A few ignorant men." But then he asked, what? What killed James Reed? And he answered, "An irrelevant church. A church that stands amid evil. A church that serves as a taillight rather than a headlight. A church that is an echo rather than a voice." He said, what killed James Reed was an indifferent clergy, irresponsible political system, corrupt law enforcement, timid government, and an uncommitted Negro population. And his words still ring true today. This chapel is certainly on the National Historical Register. But this is one of those rare places in history that just hold that tender spot in our emotional memory. It holds deep meaning for so many of us. You walk in and you behold the sight and you're just moved. Your heart is moved. And so as we walked in and we looked around and we took in the light and we took in these gorgeous stained glass windows, we all found ourselves just sitting on the pew. All the buses emptied out. We were all in there. Some of us were standing in the back and we were respectfully quiet, just in this space, taking in the knowledge of all of those people who had been in that place before us. And from the silence we started singing, and those few people who started singing this old gospel hymn just inspired us all to stand up, and we all started singing, "I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom." And it was soulful, and it was powerful. We were being fed a taste of church that we don't normally understand. This is the Black church. And it's quite different from what we know to be church. First, in the black church, it's music. It's always music. It's gospel music. It's music, quite honestly, I don't think we really understand, simply because we have not suffered enough to get it at a soul level. I hear us trying to sing This Little Light of Mine, and we sing it like it's a children's tune. We don't understand the words to be saying things like, no matter how much you oppress me, no matter how hard or how long you hold me down, no matter the depths or your deepest evil of darkness, my light is going to shine. I promise you, my light is going to shine. That is what that song's about. Here in the Deep South, in Selma, Alabama, in the African American church, in the black church, in this chapel, 3 gorgeous stained glass windows illuminating Jesus, the white Jesus. And in the center of the sanctuary, a lit light bulbs glowing of a white cross, all to praise Jesus. Here he is loved. He is loved because he is the one who understands suffering and oppression. Here he is understood as a good man and a faithful servant who was wrongfully accused, who suffered brutality, who ultimately paid with his life. In the black church, Jesus is the one true light, pure, unconditional love. In the church, it's praise Jesus, always praise Jesus, and most of us struggle with that. And finally, in the black church, this was the one and only place where whites stayed out, a true sanctuary, a place where they gathered their strength and lifted up their community. And most importantly, it was a place free of their oppressor. That's why so many ministers were leaders of the civil rights movement. That's where it started, in the church. That's where the movement began. The civil rights movement grew out of these small gatherings on Sunday afternoon. Wherever we went in Alabama, we were either outside, we were on a bus, we were in a school cafeteria, or we were in a church. And every part of our schedule focused around when we were going to be in church. We were in church a lot. Everything is centered around the church, and it took me showing up in Selma for me to get that at a soul level. So why did we show up in Selma? Why 50 years ago did we show up in Selma? Well, the Reverend Mark Morrison Reed will say to you it was because of personal relationships. That's what made UU ministers go to Selma. That's what made them show up 50 years ago. 5 of our UU ministers in Boston went to seminary with Dr. Martin Luther King at Boston University. They knew their old friend Martin. Martin called them and they came. They got on the phone and they called their friends. And then they got on their phone and they called their friends, and that's why we went to Selma, because of personal relationships. Others came because of their personal relationships, their meaningful, true, real, honest friendships with African Americans. Some came because they had real connections in the black community, and that's why Jim Reed went. Jim Reed went because he lived in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and he served in the Roxbury community of Boston. The cause was voting rights, but they came because of the personal connection, the personal relationships with one another. That's why they showed up. Those relationships are what made them care enough to show up. So why did we go 50 years later? Well, I'll tell you personally, having served in the neighborhoods of Dorchester and Roxbury, I have always felt that connection to the Reverend Reed's ministry, and I am both humbled and honored to have briefly walked in his footsteps, to follow the ministry he created in Roxbury. So I made a phone call, and I called my seminary classmate Emily, and I said, "Are you going?" And by the time I hung up that phone, we were going to Selma. The decision was made. And then I asked Linda to go. I wanted her to join me because 50 years ago, it wasn't just you clergy that went. It was congregants who went. I wanted both of them, both ministry and clergy, or congregants, to show up for us down in Selma. So on Sunday, we stood there, outside of Brown Chapel, waiting for church to let out, waiting to walk across that bridge. And so I took a look around Selma, and there is utter poverty in Selma. Utter poverty. But at the same time, I witnessed the beloved community. They were all out. All the citizens of Selma were out. And I noticed somber memorials. And I took in spirited celebrations. Roughly 450 Unitarian Universalists marching. Half of us were wearing our Sunday best, and the other half were wearing our hard-to-miss sunshine yellow. And there we were, and we walked with 70,000 people in this crowd. Most of the crowd were people of color. We were about the only white folk there. We showed up. And as we walked by, residents who were sitting on their porches and waving us on in this small southern town, they saw our yellow and they said, "Yay, the Unitarians." It was something. This is called showing up. And in life, it is important to show up. When and where you show up is entirely up to you. But I will tell you this, when and where you show up says what you truly care about. You can pretend to care, but you can't pretend to show up. Amen.